The lights on New Haven Station blinked against the walls, and Katie wiped the table for the 7th time that night. And her feet hurt in the old boots she needed to replace 3 months ago, and working at the Stellar View Cafe was not her dream. But it paid the bills, and she looked at the big windows where Earth hung like a blue ball in the black space. And 5 years since she left home. And 5 years since her brother died and left her with nothing but bills and memories. The door opened, and people walked in, and Katie looked up and saw a man in the middle. And she knew him from the news, and Prince Hassan al-Mansour was one of the richest men in space, and his family owned the mining in the asteroid belt and controlled the fusion reactors that powered human life, and he had people with him. And guards and the restaurant manager Tony rushed to help them and took them to the best table near the window. And other workers wanted to serve such an important customer because the tip could pay rent for a month. But Tony looked at Katie and nodded at the table, and her heart jumped because this was her section, and she fixed her uniform and checked how she looked in the shiny wall and walked to the table with her work smile. And Prince Hassan looked up when she came, and his eyes were kind, and he ordered for everyone in perfect English with a small accent, and picked expensive food without looking at prices, and his friends barely looked at her and were busy with their tablets talking about money and politics on Mars. Katie turned to leave, but the prince raised his hand and she stopped, and he smiled, sorry, and ordered wine that cost more than she made in 6 months, and she wrote it down and went to the bar thinking about the tip. And the evening went well, and the prince and his people were polite if distant, and Katie did her job, and she just brought their main food, when she saw something strange. And one of the guards with metal eyes was watching her with hard focus, and not the normal way customers looked, but something sharper and more serious. She ignored it and kept working. But when she came back to fill water, she found Prince Hassan writing on a paper napkin, and real paper was expensive in space, where every gram mattered, and seeing him use it for a note seemed odd. And as she poured water, he folded the napkin and put it under his empty bread plate, and his eyes met hers, and she saw something that made her heart beat fast, and not romance, but urgent and fear even. When she cleared the plate, she took the napkin smooth and put it in her apron pocket, and her hands shook a little, but she did not know why, and the rest of the meal was normal, and the group paid and left a good tip, but not huge, and left with the same speed they came. And Katie waited until her break and locked herself in the staff bathroom, and under the bright lights, she opened the napkin, and the writing was neat and beautiful. And what she read made her blood cold. There is poison in your drink, and do not consume anything. You did not prepare yourself, and you are in danger, and trust no one in your workplace. And I have transferred 10,000 credits to your account, and use it to disappear. And you have 24 hours, and I am sorry, I cannot do more. Katie read it 3 times, and her mind did not want to understand, and poison and danger and 10,000 credits, and this had to be a joke. But when she checked her account on her pad, she saw the money and 10,000 credits from an account with no name or trail. Her hands shook now, and she thought back over her shift, and she drank half a cup of coffee from the staff room, an hour before the prince came, and she felt fine. But poison could be slow, and especially the smart kinds in an age of advanced science. Katie decided and splashed cold water on her face and breathed steady and walked back to the floor and told Tony she felt sick, which was not a total lie. And he let her leave early and looked annoyed, and as she got her things from her locker, she saw her coworker Gary watching her with a look she could not understand. She left through the back door and felt scared right away, and the hallways of New Haven Station suddenly seemed full of danger, and every stranger could be an enemy, and every shadow could hide bad things. By the time she got to her tiny apartment in the living section, Katie made another choice, and if this was real, and if she was in danger, then she needed help. But the note said, trust no one at work, and that left few choices. She opened her communication and wrote a message to the one person she still trusted in the universe, and her childhood friend Danny Carter, who worked as a security analyst for the station, and she kept it unclear, just asking him to meet her at their old spot in the observation deck, but marked it urgent. While she waited for his answer, Katie began to pack, and if she was going to disappear, she needed to travel light. But as her hands moved through drawers, her mind raced with questions. Why would anyone want to poison her, and she was nobody, and a waitress with no connections and no secrets and nothing that could threaten anyone powerful enough to afford murder, unless they mistook her for someone else? But the warning was placed where she would find it, and the money went to her account. Not some stranger. And why would a billionaire prince risk himself to warn her? And what did he know that his guards did? Not, or maybe his guards were the problem. Her pad made noise and Danny agreed to meet her in an hour, and Katie finished packing one bag and sat to wait with the napkin in her hand. And as she looked at the beautiful writing, a new thought came. What if this was not about her? And what if she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and the prince saw something that made him act? But if so, what did he see? And more important, what kind of danger was so serious that a man with unlimited money felt his only choice was to warn a random waitress to run outside her window? New Haven Station kept turning and Earth hung beautiful in the empty space, but for Katie Sullivan, the universe had suddenly become a much darker and more dangerous place. Danny Carter stood in the observation deck looking at his reflection against the stars, and checked his watch for the third time, and Katie was late, which was not like her, and they knew each other since childhood in Seattle before space opportunities drew them both away from Earth. He was about to send another message when she appeared moving fast through the tourists and station people who came to watch the stars, and her face was white, and she carried a travel bag, and Danny felt worried. She gave him the napkin without talking, and he read it, then read it again, and his face got hard. And as a security analyst for New Haven Station, he dealt with threats before. But this was different, because this involved someone he cared about. They found a quiet corner and sat, and Katie told him everything with a low, urgent voice, and the prince, and the strange warning, and the money, and the fear that grew since she left the restaurant, and Danny listened without stopping her, and his mind worked through possibilities. When she finished, he stayed quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his pad and began typing fast, and Katie watched as lines of code moved across the screen. And Danny was always good with computers, but his job gave him access to systems that could answer questions most people could not ask. After several minutes, he looked up troubled and told her what he found. And the restaurant where she worked was owned by a company called Meridian Holdings, and that company was owned by a bigger thing called the Consortium, which was a secret organization that appeared in many station operations but kept careful anonymity. More interesting, Prince Hassan was scheduled to attend a private meeting in the commercial sector tonight, and that meeting was suddenly canceled 2 hours ago with no reason, and his group left the station on an emergency shuttle going to his personal asteroid base. Katie felt her stomach drop, and whatever the prince saw or learned was serious enough to make him leave his plans and run, and he took time to warn her before he left, and the meaning was huge. Danny kept searching, going deeper into secret systems he should not access, but learned to navigate through years of careful contacts and blind eyes from bosses who found his skills useful, and what he found next made him go very still. There were 17 deaths on New Haven Station over the past 6 months, and alone they looked unrelated, and a maintenance worker fell into a reactor, and a trader died from an allergy, and a scientist killed himself. But when Danny pulled them together and looked at the pattern, something appeared. All 17 victims worked at places owned by Meridian Holdings at some point in the last year, and all 17 deaths were called accidents or natural. And all 17 happened just before major business deals or political events involving the consortium. Katie felt ice in her blood and asked Danny what it meant, and he looked at her with fear and determination mixed and told her he thought the restaurant was being used as a disposal site, and people who knew too much or saw too much or were some kind of threat were being killed, and their deaths made to look like accidents or suicides. But why her, and she was nobody and knew nothing? And Danny asked her to think carefully, and had she seen anything unusual or heard strange conversations, and even something small could matter. Katie searched her memory, and the past weeks were all the same, with shifts and tired feet and endless orders. But then something came up, and 3 nights ago she was closing when she saw 2 men in suits leaving the private dining room, and she thought nothing then. But now she remembered one was Gary, her co-worker, and the same Gary who watched her strange tonight. Gary worked in the kitchen, not the dining room, and the private room was supposed to be empty that night, and she checked the reservation system herself. But there they were, Gary and an older man she did not know carrying a briefcase between them. Danny looked worse and told her that Gary's full name was Gary Mitchell, and according to station records, Mitchell had a sealed juvenile record and worked at 3 other places. Before the Stellar View and all were closed or sold more bad, Mitchell was present or on shift during 12 of the 17 suspicious deaths. and he was not always serving the victims, but he had access to the kitchen and supply rooms and all, the places where someone could tamper with food or drink without being seen. Katie felt the world tilting, and Gary always seemed harmless, and a quiet guy who kept to himself and did his job. But now she saw him different, and an assassin hiding in plain sight, using a restaurant as his hunting ground. And she almost drank the poisoned coffee, and the coffee probably sitting in the staff room right now waiting for someone else, unless Gary already got rid of it. Knowing his attempt failed, Danny made a choice and told Katie they needed to go to his bosses with this. But Katie grabbed his arm, stopping him, and the note said, "Trust no one." And what if the corruption went higher than they knew? And what if station security was bad? Danny wanted to argue, but saw the fear in her eyes and understood. And in a place like New Haven Station, where millions lived and worked in a careful balance of politics and money, corruption could run deep. And the consortium clearly had resources and connections. And going to the wrong person could get them both killed. So he offered another way, and he had a contact in someone who worked outside the normal chain, and a woman named Carla Rodriguez, who operated in gray areas between legal and illegal, and traded in information, and owed him a favor from a case he quietly buried last year. And if anyone could help them, it would be her. Katie agreed slowly, and did not like involving criminals, but liked trusting official channels even less. And Danny sent a coded message to Rodriguez and got an answer in minutes, and she would meet them in 2 hours at a place in the lower industrial section, far from tourists and cameras. While they waited, Danny kept researching and discovered the private meeting Prince Hassan was scheduled for was with people from a mining company called Helios Extraction, and Helios recently found a massive deposit of rare earth in the outer asteroid belt, and was looking for investors and political support. The discovery could shift power in the solar system, and whoever controlled those resources would have leverage over everything, from shipbuilding to fusion reactors. And it was exactly the kind of situation where powerful interests would kill to protect their advantages. Katie began seeing the bigger picture, and Prince Hassan with his family mining operations would be a major player in any deal with Helios Extraction. And the consortium apparently did not want him involved, and they planned something at that meeting, and something that needed his absence or maybe his death. But the prince learned of the danger maybe from his own intelligence and fled, and on his way out, he saw Katie and knew her as the waitress from the restaurant where he ate earlier, and realized she was in danger, and maybe he knew about the pattern of deaths, and maybe he investigated the consortium himself and understood how they worked. Whatever his thinking, he tried to save her. And now she and Danny were caught in something much bigger than a simple murder plot, and they were up against an organization that had been killing obstacles for at least 6 months, and that had infiltrated multiple businesses on New Haven Station, and that had resources enough to make deaths look like accidents as the time came for their meeting with Rodriguez. Danny gave Katie final instructions, and they would travel separately, taking different routes and watching for anyone following, and if either suspected they were compromised, they would abort and find a new way to talk. Katie nodded, trying to look confident, and as she stood to leave, Danny caught her hand and told her to be careful, and that he would not lose another friend to this station. And Katie knew he was thinking of his partner who died 2 years ago in what was called an equipment failure, and now she wondered if that death was as accidental as it seemed. Danny Carter stared at his workstation screens, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep, and he had been searching through station security databases for 6 hours straight, looking for any anomaly that might point to the consortium server location, and the search was tedious and risky, and if anyone in the station authority was compromised, his inquiries might trigger an alert. But he found something, and a series of power draws in the commercial sector that did not match the registered businesses in those locations, and the excess energy was being routed through carefully disguised pathways to a storage facility that was officially owned by a shipping company called Nova Transit Solutions. When Danny pulled the records for Nova Transit, he discovered the company was a subsidiary of Meridian Holdings and the same corporation that owned the Stellar View Cafe, and the connection was too obvious to be coincidence, and he found the consortium nerve center on New Haven Station. He immediately transmitted the information to Rodriguez through their secured channel, and her response came back within minutes, and she would assemble a team and prepare for extraction within 12 hours, and in the meantime, Danny needed to maintain his normal routine, and avoid drawing attention to his discovery. That same morning, Katie reported for her shift at the Stellar View Cafe, and she felt the weight of every eye on her as she entered through the employee entrance, and the kitchen staff greeted her normally, but she could not help scanning their faces for signs of conspiracy. And Gary Mitchell was already there working at his prep station with his usual efficiency. When their eyes met, he smiled and asked if she was feeling better. And Katie forced herself to smile back and make small talk about food poisoning and bad timing, and inside her heart was hammering. And this man, this seemingly ordinary coworker, had probably killed at least a dozen people, and he might have been the one to poison her coffee 2 nights ago. And now she had to pretend everything was normal. Tony gave her the morning shift assignments, and Katie began her work. And she served tables and took orders and smiled at customers with a professional warmth that felt like a mask over her fear. And the tracking device in her pocket was a small reassurance. But she knew Rodriguez people could not save her if Mitchell decided to act in a crowded restaurant. The hours crawled by, and Katie watched Mitchell whenever she could do so without being obvious, and he worked methodically, preparing ingredients and cooking orders with the skill of someone who had done this job many times. But she noticed small things she missed before, and the way he always positioned himself to watch the dining room, and the subtle earpiece he wore supposedly for kitchen communications, but possibly for something else, and the careful attention he paid to who came and went. Around midday, something changed, and Mitchell received a message on his pad, and his entire demeanor shifted, and he became more alert and more focused. And when he looked at Katie this time, there was calculation in his eyes rather than casual friendliness. Katie felt ice forming in her stomach. And something had happened, and Mitchell had received orders or information that changed the situation, and she casually moved toward the main dining room, putting more distance and more witnesses between herself and the kitchen. Rodriguez had positioned 3 of her operatives in the restaurant posing as customers, and Katie had been briefed on their appearances but tried not to look at them directly. And one was a middle-aged woman eating alone near the window, and another was a young couple sharing a romantic meal, and the third was a businessman working on his pad over coffee. But if Rodriguez people were here, then the consortium probably had their own people watching as well. And Katie felt trapped in a game where she did not know all the players or understand all the rules, and one wrong move and one suspicious glance could trigger violence that would endanger everyone in the restaurant. She was taking an order from a family with 2 young children when Tony appeared at her elbow and told her there was a customer complaint about an order she served earlier, and asked her to come to his office. And Katie's instincts screamed danger, and Tony never pulled her off the floor for a complaint before, and this was wrong. She told Tony she would come as soon as she finished with this table, and he insisted it was urgent, and Katie made eye contact with the middle-aged woman near the window and one of Rodriguez's operatives, and saw the woman's subtle nod of acknowledgement and help was watching. But would it be enough? Katie followed Tony toward his office, and her hand slipping into her pocket to grip the tracking device. And the office was located in a back corridor, away from the dining room and past the kitchen and storage areas, and it was isolated and private and a perfect place for an ambush. But Tony surprised her, and instead of leading her to his office, he pulled her into a supply closet and closed the door, and in the dim light from a single overhead panel, his face was pale and frightened, and told her she needed to leave the station immediately, and she was in danger and he could not protect her anymore. Katie stared at him in shock, and Tony knew, and how long had he known, and he seemed to read her thoughts, and explained quickly, and he had been recruited by the consortium 3 years ago, and forced to cooperate after they discovered he had been embezzling from the restaurant to pay gambling debts. And they used his establishment as a cover for their operations and made him provide access and alibis. But he never wanted anyone to die, and he convinced himself he was just providing information and facilitating meetings and turning blind eyes to suspicious behavior. And the murders had been Mitchell work. And Tony pretended not to know, but now they ordered him to deliver Katie to Mitchell, and he could not do it. And not to her, and not to someone he worked with for over a year. Katie asked why they wanted her dead and what had she done, and Tony told her it was not about what she did, but what she saw. And 3 nights ago, when she noticed him and the consortium representative leaving the private dining room, she witnessed the transfer of data that implicated several high-ranking station officials in the conspiracy, and she did not know what she saw, but the consortium could not take the risk that she might remember or investigate. Moreover, Prince Hassan, warning had marked her as someone he considered important enough to save, and that alone made her dangerous in the eyes of the consortium, and they would assume she knew more than she did, and had connections she did not have. Tony pressed a data chip into her hand and told her it contained everything he knew about the consortium. Operations on New Haven Station, and names and dates and transactions and all the evidence she would need to expose them. And he had been keeping it as insurance, but now he was giving it to her. And maybe she could use it to survive before Katie could respond. The door burst open, and Gary Mitchell stood in the corridor, and he was not alone. And 2 security guards in official station uniforms flanked him, but their faces were hard and cold and nothing like the helpful officers Katie had seen patrolling the public areas. Mitchell looked at Tony with disgust and told him he made a fatal mistake, and Tony stood his ground and said he was done being part of murder. And Mitchell smiled without humor and told him he had been done. The moment he opened his mouth, Katie activated the tracking device in her pocket as Mitchell raised a weapon and a compact energy pistol that would be silent and leave minimal evidence, and time seemed to slow, and she saw Tony move to push her behind him and saw the guards reach for their own weapons and saw Mitchell's finger tighten on the trigger. The shot never came, and instead, the lights went out, plunging the corridor into absolute darkness, and emergency lighting should have activated immediately, but someone disabled it. And in the confusion, Katie heard shouting and the sound of impacts and the discharge of weapons firing blind. A hand grabbed her arm and she nearly screamed before a voice whispered to stay quiet and follow, and she recognized Rodriguez's voice and let herself be pulled through the darkness, and behind them, the sounds of fighting continued, and someone, probably Tony, cried out in pain. Rodriguez led Katie through what felt like a maze of corridors, moving with the confidence of someone who memorized the layout, and after what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into a maintenance passage, and the lights here were still functioning, and Katie could see Rodriguez was not alone. And the 3 operatives from the restaurant were with her, along with 2 others. Katie did not recognize. Rodriguez demanded to know if Katie had the device, and Katie pulled out the tracking beacon, and Rodriguez deactivated it with a quick gesture, and then Katie remembered the data chip Tony gave her, and she pulled it out and showed it to Rodriguez, explaining what Tony said. Rodriguez's eyes lit up with fierce satisfaction, and this was exactly what they needed, and combined with the data Danny would extract from the consortium servers, they would have enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. But first they had to survive, and Mitchell and his team would be right behind them. And now they knew Katie had allies, and the situation had escalated from a quiet assassination to an open conflict, and the consortium would throw everything they had at stopping them. Rodriguez checked her communications and swore, and Danny had sent an alert, and his workstation had been flagged by internal security, and he was forced to run before extracting the server data, and he was heading to a safe house Rodriguez maintained in the residential sector, but he was being pursued. They needed a new plan, and Rodriguez made quick decisions and sent 2 of her operatives to help Danny, while the rest would escort Katie to the Nova Transit facility, and if they could not extract the data remotely, they would do it physically, and they would break into the consortium headquarters and take everything. Katie asked about Tony, and Rodriguez was quiet for a moment before admitting she did not know his status, and her people created the distraction by cutting power and attacking Mitchell Group. But in the darkness and confusion, Tony might have been killed by either side, and they would find out later if they survived. The group moved out, traveling through the maintenance tunnels, that honeycombed New Haven station. And Katie realized this network of passages, invisible to most residents, formed a second station beneath the familiar surface. And here, among the pipes and conduits and machinery, people like Rodriguez operated, in the shadows, playing games of espionage and survival, while ordinary citizens lived their lives unaware of the battles being waged around them. They were approaching the commercial sector when Rodriguez received another message, and this one made her face go pale, and she told Katie they had a problem, and a big one, and the consortium had activated a station-wide security alert claiming there was a terrorist cell operating on New Haven, and station security was locking down entire sectors and conducting searches. It was a brilliant move, and the consortium just turned the entire station authority into their personal army. and anyone helping Katie and Rodriguez would be treated as an enemy of public safety, and anyone who saw them could report their location to what would effectively be a hostile force. Rodriguez made a decision, and they would split up and she would take Katie to the Nova Transit facility, while her remaining operatives created diversions in other sectors, and it was risky, but their best chance, and if they could get the data and get it to someone who could use it before the lockdown trapped them, they might still win, as the operatives dispersed into the darkness of the maintenance tunnels. Katie found herself alone with Rodriguez racing toward what might be their last confrontation with the consortium, and she thought of Prince Hassan warning note, and of Tony's sacrifice, and of all the victims who died to protect the secrets they were about to expose, and she thought of her brother who died 5 years ago in what she had been told was an industrial accident, and now she wondered if that too had been murder dressed up as mishap, and how deep did this conspiracy go, and how long had it been operating, and how many lives had been destroyed to protect the power and profits of those at the top. Katie gripped the data chip tightly, and followed Rodriguez deeper into the heart of New Haven Station, ready to face whatever came next, and the trap had been sprung. But she and Rodriguez were not caught yet, and the game was still in play and the outcome was far from certain. The Nova Transit Solutions facility occupied 3 connected modules in the commercial sector, and from the outside it looked like a legitimate shipping company with loading docks and cargo containers marked with various corporate logos. But Rodriguez knew better, and the real operation was hidden in the center module behind walls of security that would challenge even the most sophisticated infiltration team. She and Katie approached from a maintenance shaft that opened into a service corridor adjacent to the facility, and Rodriguez had been planning this raid for weeks, studying schematics and security protocols, identifying weak points in the consortium defenses, but she never expected to execute the plan this soon, or under such desperate circumstances. They paused at the entrance to the corridor, while Rodriguez checked her equipment, and she carried a compact kit of electronics that could bypass most locks and override many security systems. And Katie, meanwhile, felt utterly unprepared for what they were about to attempt, and she was a waitress who stumbled into a conspiracy. Not a trained operative, Rodriguez seemed to sense her fear and told Katie that fear was good, and that it kept people alert and alive, and the ones who did not survive were usually the ones who thought they were invincible. And then she outlined the plan, and they would enter through a service entrance that Rodriguez's reconnaissance had identified as the least monitored point. And once inside, they would have approximately 10 minutes before the facility security systems detected the intrusion and locked down. 10 minutes to reach the server room and extract the data and escape, and it seemed impossible. But Rodriguez moved with the calm confidence of someone who had done impossible things before, and Katie took a deep breath and followed. The service entrance yielded to Rodriguez tools with surprising ease, and they slipped inside and found themselves in a narrow corridor lined with utility conduits, and the air smelled of ozone and recycled coolant, and overhead cameras swept the passage in predetermined patterns. But Rodriguez had studied those patterns and guided Katie through the blind spots. They moved deeper into the facility, past storage rooms filled with shipping containers that probably held legitimate cargo, mixed with whatever the consortium was actually trafficking. And Katie glimpsed labels from Mars and Europa, and the outer asteroid colonies, and the scope of the operation was staggering. A door ahead opened without warning, and 2 guards emerged, and Rodriguez reacted instantly, and her hand moving to the compact energy weapon concealed under her jacket. But she did not fire, and instead she activated a device that emitted a pulse of electromagnetic energy, and the guards' augmented implants overloaded, and they collapsed unconscious. But alive, Rodriguez pulled Katie past the fallen guards and through the door they just exited, and beyond was a larger room, filled with rows of server racks, and their indicator lights blinking in complex patterns. And this was it, and the consortium data center, and the nerve center of their operations on New Haven Station. But they were not alone. And at the far end of the room, a technician sat at a control station, monitoring the servers. And he looked up as they entered, and his hand moving toward an alarm panel, and Rodriguez was faster, and another electromagnetic pulse, and the technician slumped over his console. Katie asked if he was dead, and Rodriguez checked his pulse and confirmed he was alive, just unconscious, and she did not kill unless absolutely necessary. And it was a rule that kept her operating in the gray areas without becoming the monster. she fought against. Rodriguez moved to the nearest terminal and began her work, and her fingers flew across the interface with practiced speed, and Katie watched as lines of code scrolled across multiple screens and encryption barriers falling away under Rodriguez's expert attack, and the information broker had learned her skills in military intelligence before going private, and those skills were now being put to their ultimate test. Minutes ticked by, and Katie kept watch on the door, expecting security to burst through at any moment. But the facility remained quiet, and perhaps the station-wide alert had drawn resources away from this location, or perhaps the consortium was so confident in their security that they did not feel the need for a large presence. Rodriguez swore suddenly, and Katie turned and asked what was wrong. And Rodriguez explained the servers were equipped with a deadman switch, and if anyone tried to download the complete database, it would trigger an automatic wipe, and she could extract pieces of information, but getting everything would destroy the evidence they needed. Katie thought quickly and suggested combining what Rodriguez could extract with the data chip Tony gave her, and maybe together they would have enough. And Rodriguez nodded and adjusted her approach, and instead of going for the complete database, she targeted specific files and financial records and communication logs and personnel rosters and evidence of the deaths and the cover-ups. The extraction process was agonizingly slow, and each file had to be carefully pulled from the servers without triggering the security protocols, and Katie watched the chronometer on her datapad as their 10-minute window approached and then passed, and they were on borrowed time. Now Rodriguez was nearly finished when the alarms finally sounded, and klaxons echoed through the facility, and the lighting shifted to emergency red and automated defenses, activated ceiling doors and flooding corridors with security drones. And they had been detected. Rodriguez grabbed the data chip containing the extracted files and pulled Katie toward a secondary exit she marked during her reconnaissance, but the door was already sealed and its magnetic locks engaged, and they were trapped in the server room with security closing in from all sides. Katie asked if Rodriguez had an escape plan, and the information broker smiled grimly and admitted she hoped they would not need it. But yes, she had a backup, and she moved to a wall panel and began working on the access controls. And behind that panel was an air-handling duct, large enough for a person to crawl through, and it would be tight and uncomfortable and dangerous, but it led to an exterior maintenance passage. The panel opened just as the main door to the server room began to cycle, and Rodriguez pushed Katie into the duct first and followed close, behind, resealing the panel from the inside, and they crawled through darkness. Behind them they heard voices and the metallic sounds of security forces entering the server room, and someone shouted orders to search every possible exit, and Katie forced herself to keep moving, ignoring the claustrophobia and the sharp edges of the duct that scraped her hands and knees. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, they emerged into a maintenance passage, and Rodriguez checked her bearings and led Katie through a series of corridors that gradually took them away from the commercial sector, and they needed to reach her safe house where she had equipment to analyze the data and communications gear to transmit it to the right people. But first they had to meet up with Danny, and Rodriguez activated her secure communication channel and sent a coded message, and the response came back within seconds, but it was not from Danny, and it was from one of Rodriguez's operatives, and the news was not good. Danny had been cornered in the residential sector by consortium security forces, and he was pinned down in an apartment complex, unable to escape without being captured or killed, and the operatives who went to help him were engaged in a firefight trying to create an opening for his escape. Rodriguez made an immediate decision, and they would go help Danny, and Katie protested that they should get the data to safety first. But Rodriguez shook her head, and she did not leave her people behind, and it was another rule, and one that earned her the loyalty of operatives throughout the solar system. They changed direction, moving through the station underbelly toward the residential sector, and as they traveled, Rodriguez explained their situation and the consortium controlled station security, which meant they effectively controlled the station, and Rodriguez's team was outnumbered and outgunned, and their only advantage was mobility and knowledge of the station hidden pathways. But that advantage was eroding, and every minute they spent on the station was a minute for the consortium to tighten their net, and eventually they would run out of places to hide and routes to escape, and they needed a way off New Haven Station. And soon Katie asked if Rodriguez had any ships available, and the information broker admitted she had access to a private shuttle docked in a remote bay, but reaching it would require crossing through secured areas that were now being actively patrolled, and it was a risk. But at this point, everything was a risk. They reached the residential sector and found chaos, and station security had cordoned off an entire block of apartments, claiming they were searching for dangerous terrorists, and residents were being evacuated under armed guard, and anyone who resisted was being detained. And Katie saw families being separated, and elderly people being dragged from their homes, and felt a fresh wave of anger at the consortium ruthlessness. Rodriguez led Katie through a service entrance into the apartment complex, and the sounds of weapons fire echoed through the corridors along with shouted orders and screams, and they found Rodriguez operatives on the third level defending a barricaded position near the stairwell, and Danny was with them armed, with a security weapon he'd taken from one of his pursuers. He looked exhausted but determined, and when he saw Katie, relief flashed across his face before hardening back into focus, and he told them the situation was untenable, and they were surrounded, and security forces were preparing to storm their position, and if they did not break out in the next few minutes, they would all be captured or killed. Rodriguez assessed the tactical situation with the cold efficiency of someone trained for exactly these scenarios, and she had a plan, but it was desperate, and they would create a diversion on the lower level, drawing the security forces away from the stairwell, and while the enemy was distracted, the group would escape through a maintenance shaft that led to an adjacent building. One of the operatives volunteered to set the diversion, and it was effectively a suicide mission, and everyone knew it, but the operative, a young woman named Lisa Chen, insisted she was expendable, and she had no family, and no attachments, and had been living on borrowed time since she crossed the wrong people 2 years ago, and at least this way her death would mean something. Rodriguez gripped Lisa's shoulder and told her she was not expendable, and that her life had value, but Lisa smiled sadly and said sometimes value was measured in sacrifice, and she took a bag of improvised explosives and kissed Rodriguez on the cheek and disappeared down the stairwell before anyone could stop her. The explosion came 30 seconds later, followed by screams and the sound of security forces rushing toward the source, and Rodriguez did not waste the opportunity Lisa gave them, and she led the group to the maintenance shaft, and they climbed down into darkness. They emerged in the adjacent building basement among storage units and utility equipment, and Rodriguez checked her communications and saw that Lisa's signal had gone dark, and she allowed herself a moment of grief before pushing it aside, and they could not afford emotion now, and there would be time to mourn later if they survived. The group moved through the building and into the streets of the residential sector, and the lockdown was in full effect now with checkpoints at every intersection, but Rodriguez's knowledge of the station hidden paths allowed them to bypass most of the security, and they traveled through basements and crawl spaces and forgotten corridors, always moving toward the shuttle bay where escape waited. Katie found herself next to Danny during a brief rest stop, and he asked if she was okay, and she almost laughed at the absurdity of the question, and she had been poisoned and hunted and shot at and watched a woman sacrifice herself to save them. But she was alive, and that counted for something. Danny told her about the data he nearly extracted before being forced to run, and he managed to copy some financial records that showed the consortium reach extended far beyond New Haven Station, and they controlled businesses and officials throughout the solar system from Earth to the outer colonies, and exposing them would shake the foundations of human civilization in space. Katie showed him the data chip Tony gave her, and the files Rodriguez extracted from the server raid, and between the three sources they had enough evidence to destroy the consortium, but first they had to survive long enough to release it. Rodriguez signaled that it was time to move again, and the shuttle bay was close now. Just a few more corridors and one final checkpoint to bypass, and Katie felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. And they were going to make it, and they were going to escape, and expose the truth, and bring justice for Prince Hassan, and for Tony, and for Lisa, and for all the other victims. But as they rounded the final corner, that hope shattered, and the corridor ahead was blocked by a line of armed security forces, and at their center stood Gary Mitchell, and his face twisted with satisfaction, and behind him the shuttle bay door was sealed and guarded, and there would be no escape this way. Mitchell told them it was over, and they were surrounded and outnumbered and out of options, and if they surrendered now, and Handed over the data, he would ensure their deaths were quick and painless, and if they resisted, he would make it. Slow, Rodriguez looked at Katie and Danny and at her remaining operatives and made a final decision. And they would not surrender, and they would not go quietly. And if this was the end, they would make it count. She raised her weapon and the others followed her example. And in the narrow corridor of New Haven Station, with the future of humanity expansion into space hanging in the balance, the final confrontation began. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats, and Mitchell and his security forces held their weapons steady, confident in their superior numbers and position, and Rodriguez and her team stood defiant despite being outgunned, determined to fight rather than surrender. Then Danny did something unexpected, and he pulled out his data pad and activated a program he had been preparing since the beginning of this crisis, and a program that would broadcast a signal throughout New Haven Station, overriding every communication channel and every screen and every public interface. And before Mitchell could react, the broadcast began, and every monitor on the station lit up with the evidence they had gathered and financial records showing the consortium corruption and communication logs revealing their conspiracy and video footage from security cameras that documented the murders they covered up as accidents. The broadcast showed everything, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the consortium interests, and the bribery of station officials, and the manipulation of markets and resources, and the names of every person involved, from low-level operatives like Mitchell to high-ranking members of the solar system political and economic elite. Mitchell's face went white as he realized what was happening, and he ordered his men to fire. But Danny had included footage of Mitchell himself in the broadcast and video from the restaurant showing him preparing poison and moving through corridors with suspicious packages and meeting with known criminals, and the security forces hesitated, suddenly uncertain whether they were following legitimate orders or protecting a murderer. The lower industrial section of New Haven Station was different from the clean hallways and observation decks of the living and business areas. And here the walls were bare metal marked with utility codes and warnings, and the air tasted of recycled coolant and electricity from the massive power lines that ran through like veins carrying power to the station. Vital systems. Katie made her way through the maintenance passages following the route Danny sent to her pad, and she passed workers in dirty coveralls who barely looked at her, too focused on their jobs to care about another stranger in the depths. And the lighting here was dimmer and more basic, and shadows pooled in corners where the overhead lights did not reach. She found the location Danny specified, and a small alcove near a thermal processing unit, and the machinery hummed with barely contained energy, giving background noise that would hide conversation from any listening devices, and it was a good spot for a secret meeting, which made Katie nervous about the kind of person who would choose such a place. She did not wait long, and a woman came from the shadows with the casual confidence of someone who owned whatever space she occupied, and Carla Rodriguez was shorter than Katie expected, barely reaching 5'2", but moved with the coiled readiness of a fighter, and her dark hair was pulled back severe, and her eyes were sharp and calculating behind augmented reality contact lenses that probably gave her access to data feeds Katie could only imagine. Danny arrived moments later from a different direction, and Rodriguez nodded to him with familiar respect before turning her attention to Katie and asked what information they had. And Katie handed her the napkin while Danny gave his research files to a secure data chip. Rodriguez read the warning note, then plugged the chip into her pad and scrolled through Danny findings, and her face stayed neutral. But Katie noticed her jaw tighten slightly as she absorbed the information about the pattern of deaths and Gary Mitchell involvement. After several minutes of silence broken only by the hum of machinery, Rodriguez looked up and told them they were dealing with something worse than they realized, and the consortium was not just a criminal organization, and it was a coordinated effort by several of the most powerful families and corporations in the solar system to maintain control over the emerging economy of the asteroid belt and outer planets. The discovery by Helios extraction threatened that control, and if the rare Earth deposits were as large as early surveys suggested, it could break the monopolies that consortium members currently enjoyed, and new players would enter the market, and prices would change, and established power structures would crumble. Rodriguez explained the consortium had been working for months to ensure Helios extraction would be either bought out or destroyed before their claims could be proven, and they sabotaged equipment and bribed officials and eliminated key personnel. And the meeting Prince Hassan was supposed to attend was a trap designed to either recruit him to their side or remove him from the equation permanently. Katie asked why Rodriguez knew so much about this, and the information broker smiled without humor and explained that information was her business, and she had been tracking the consortium activities for years, selling intelligence to various interested parties while maintaining careful neutrality. But the situation had escalated beyond mere business and people were dying, and the body count was getting hard to ignore. She told them about her own investigation which paralleled Danny but went deeper, and she had identified not just Gary Mitchell but 3 other operatives working on New Haven Station alone. And they were part of a network that extended across the major habitats and installations throughout the solar system and the stellar. View Cafe was just one of many locations being used as covers for assassination and intelligence gathering. Danny asked the obvious question, and why would Rodriguez help them, and what was in it for her? And she was silent for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was harder than before and told them about her sister and an engineer who worked for Helios Extraction. And 3 months ago her sister died in what was ruled a shuttle accident, but Rodriguez investigated and found evidence of sabotage and evidence that pointed directly at the consortium. She had been looking for a way to strike back without exposing herself, and Katie and Danny just handed her that opportunity, and if they were willing to work with her, she could give them the resources and information they needed to expose the consortium, but it would be dangerous and there were no guarantees of success or survival. Katie and Danny exchanged glances, and they came looking for help, and found it, but at a price that suddenly seemed very steep, and they were being asked to go up against some of the most powerful entities in human civilization, with nothing but information and desperation as weapons. But what choice did they have? And Katie was already marked, for death and running would only delay the inevitable, and if they did nothing, the killing would continue and more innocent people would die, so that the powerful could protect their profits and privileges. Danny was the first to agree, and he entered law enforcement because he believed in justice even if the system was imperfect, and Rodriguez's offer gave him a chance to actually make a difference. And Katie took longer to decide, weighing the risks against the slim hope of survival, but in the end she thought of Prince Hassan, who risked his own safety to warn a stranger, and she could do no less. Rodriguez nodded, satisfied with their commitment, and outlined a plan. And first they needed hard evidence and something that could not be dismissed or covered up, and the best source would be the consortium-owned records, and Rodriguez had been working on infiltrating their networks for months, but had been blocked by sophisticated security protocols. However, Danny access to station security systems could provide a backdoor, and if he could identify the physical location where the consortium maintained their operational servers on New Haven Station, Rodriguez had the tools and expertise to extract the data they needed. Katie asked what her role would be, and Rodriguez smiled grimly and explained that Katie was the bait, and Gary Mitchell, and whoever else was working with him would come after her eventually, and when they did, Rodriguez would be watching, and they would follow the assassins back to their handlers, and it would be dangerous, but it was also the fastest way to identify everyone involved in the conspiracy. On the station, Katie felt her stomach drop, and being bait was not exactly what she hoped for, but she understood the logic, and Mitchell already knew she received a warning, and he would have to assume she knew something or suspected something, and the consortium would order him to eliminate her before she could expose their operations. Rodriguez handed Katie a small device that looked like an ordinary datapad stylus, and explained it was actually a sophisticated tracking beacon and emergency transmitter. And if Katie found herself in immediate danger, she could activate it, and Rodriguez would respond with her own team of security specialists, and it was not a guarantee of safety, but better than nothing. They spent the next hour planning the details, and Danny would return to his workstation and begin the process of identifying consortium servers, and Rodriguez would position her people to watch Katie without being obvious, and Katie would return to her apartment and wait, making herself visible and vulnerable. Before they separated, Rodriguez gave them one final piece of information, and Prince Hassan had not fled to his asteroid facility after all, and according to her sources, his shuttle was intercepted by unknown vessels shortly after leaving New Haven Station, and there was no distress call and no debris, and the prince and his entire party simply vanished. The news hit Katie like a physical blow, and the man who tried to save her life was probably dead, and killed by the very organization he tried to warn her about. and she felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity, and she never considered herself particularly courageous. But now she found herself wanting revenge, or at least justice for the prince and all the other victims. Danny put a hand on her shoulder, understanding her feelings, and told her they would make the consortium pay and that they would expose everything and ensure the deaths had not been in vain. And it was a promise neither was sure they could keep, but it felt necessary to say it anyway. Rodriguez checked her watch and told them it was time to move, and they left the industrial section separately, taking different routes back to the inhabited areas of the station. And Katie felt the weight of the tracking device in her pocket, and a small comfort against the vast machinery of conspiracy and murder that surrounded her as she walked through the familiar hallways toward her apartment. Katie found herself looking at New Haven Station with new eyes, and how many of the people she passed worked for the consortium, and how many knew about the killings, and how many were simply innocent civilians going about their lives unaware of the war being waged in the shadows. She thought about humanity expansion into space, and about the dreams that had driven millions of people to leave Earth and build new lives among the stars, and they escaped the old corruptions and inequalities, or so the propaganda claimed. But here was proof that humans carried their worst instincts with them wherever they went, and power still corrupted, and greed still killed, and ordinary people still died while the powerful protected their interests. That moment of hesitation was all Rodriguez needed, and she activated another electromagnetic pulse device, knocking out the security forces' augmented targeting systems, and then she and her operatives charged forward, using the confusion to break through the line. Katie ran with them, and her heart pounding as they fought their way toward the shuttle bay. And behind her, Mitchell was screaming orders that nobody was following anymore, and the security forces were arguing among themselves, and some trying to stop the broadcast and others questioning whether they should continue obeying commands from people who had just been exposed as criminals. The shuttle bay doors opened as Rodriguez transmitted her authorization codes, and they rushed inside and saw Rodriguez's private shuttle and a sleek vessel designed for speed rather than cargo capacity. And it could hold maybe 10 people in emergency conditions, and Rodriguez's team numbered 7, including Katie and Danny. But they were not alone in the bay, and other people had sought refuge here when the broadcast started, and station residents who recognized the truth of what they were seeing and wanted to escape before the consortium retaliated, and families with children and elderly, couples and young workers who came to the station seeking opportunity, and found corruption instead. There were at least 20 people in the bay, all desperate to leave, and the shuttle could not carry them all. And Rodriguez made eye contact with Katie and Danny, and they understood what she was thinking, and they could not save everyone, but they could not abandon innocent people to the consortium vengeance either. Rodriguez made a decision that defined her character and told her operatives to help load as many people as possible onto the shuttle, and they would overload it and risk structural failure and life support exhaustion. But they would try to save as many as they could, and it was not a practical decision, but a human one as people scrambled aboard the shuttle. Danny continued his work on his datapad, and he was not just broadcasting the evidence to New Haven Station, and he was transmitting it to every communication node in the solar system, and Earth, and Mars, and the belt and the outer colonies, and by the time the consortium could shut down one channel, the data would already be spreading through a dozen others. The broadcast included a message that Katie had recorded during their flight through the maintenance tunnels, and she told the story of Prince Hassan warning, and of the 17 deaths they uncovered, and of Tony's sacrifice and Lisa bravery. And she named the consortium members she knew about and called for justice. Most importantly, she framed it, all in terms that ordinary people could understand. And this was not about complex financial crimes or political maneuvering. And this was about powerful people killing anyone who threatened their profits. And it was about corruption at the highest levels, and it was about the choice between justice and tyranny. And humanity, for all its flaws, had always responded to injustice when confronted with it directly. And the broadcast was not just evidence, and it was a call to action. Mitchell, and what remained of his security forces, burst into the shuttle bay just as Rodriguez was sealing the hatch, and he raised his weapon and fired at the departing shuttle, but the shots bounced harmlessly off the reinforced hull, and Rodriguez piloted the overloaded vessel out of the bay and into the black space beyond New Haven Station. Inside the cramped passenger compartment, Katie found herself pressed between a woman holding a crying baby and an elderly man who kept muttering prayers, and the life support systems were already struggling with the overload and the temperature was rising, despite the cooling units running at maximum capacity. But they were alive. And the truth was spreading, and Danny confirmed that the broadcast had reached communication nodes throughout the inner solar system, and news organizations were picking up the story, and social media channels were exploding with outrage, and government officials were being forced to respond to questions about their connections. To the consortium, Rodriguez plotted a course toward the nearest independent station and a small facility in the belt that operated outside the consortium influence, and it would take 3 days to reach it with their current propulsion, and the life support would be critically strained by the end. But they had a chance. As the shuttle accelerated away from New Haven Station, Katie looked back at the massive structure that had been her home for 5 years, and she saw other ships departing, and a mass exodus as people fled the consortium. Control and station security would be in chaos, and the political structure would be collapsing, and hopefully justice would finally be served. But she also saw pursuit ships launching from the station, and the consortium was not going to let them escape without a fight, and Rodriguez saw them too, and pushed the shuttle engines harder, squeezing every bit of acceleration from the overloaded systems. Danny checked the pursuit ships' trajectories and calculated they had maybe 6 hours before being overtaken, and Rodriguez asked if he could do anything to slow them down, and he thought for a moment, then smiled with dark humor. And he could do one better. And he could turn them around. He explained that the broadcast had included not just evidence of corruption, but also specific instructions for how station security personnel could verify they were being used by the consortium, and he included access codes to sealed files and contact information for independent investigators and a detailed explanation of how the conspiracy had been hidden. Some of those pursuit ships were probably piloted by security officers who were questioning their orders, and if Danny could reach them directly and bypass their official channels, he might be able to convince them to stand down, and it was a long shot. But everything about this entire situation had been a long shot. He opened a communication channel on an emergency frequency that all station vessels monitored, and he identified himself as a station security analyst and transmitted his credentials. And then he told the truth, and he explained that the consortium had compromised their command structure and that they were pursuing civilians who had exposed criminal activity, and that by following these orders they were becoming accomplices to murder. For a long moment there was no response, and the pursuit ships maintained their course, closing the distance. And Katie felt hope draining away, and they had come so far and sacrificed so much, and now they would be caught and killed before reaching safety. Then one of the pursuit ships broke formation and changed course, heading back toward New Haven Station, and a voice came over the communication channel, and a woman who identified herself as Lieutenant Patricia Wright, and she said she reviewed the evidence and refused to participate in covering up crimes, and she would be returning to the station to arrest the individuals named in the broadcast. Other voices joined hers, and more ships broke formation, and within minutes only 2 pursuit vessels remained on their trail, and those were maintaining a following distance rather than actively pursuing, and the tide had turned, and the consortium control was breaking down in real time. Katie felt tears streaming down her face, and they were not tears of fear this time, but of relief and exhaustion and overwhelming emotion at having survived something that should have killed them. And around her in the cramped shuttle, other passengers were reacting similarly, and some were crying and some were laughing, and some were simply holding on to their loved ones. Rodriguez allowed herself a small smile before focusing back on the navigation, and they were not safe yet, and the consortium still had resources, and desperate people made dangerous enemies, but they had won the first battle, and they had exposed the truth. And that truth was now spreading through human civilization, like wildfire, burning away the lies and corruption that had hidden in the shadows. Over the next 3 days as they traveled toward safety, Danny monitored the communication channels and kept everyone informed of developments, and arrests were being made throughout the solar system, and high-ranking officials were resigning or being removed from office, and independent investigations were being launched, and the Helios extraction discovery was being secured by United Nations forces to prevent further corporate manipulation. More importantly, the 17 victims whose deaths had been covered up were being officially recognized as murder victims, and their families would receive justice and compensation, and their memories would be honored, rather than dismissed as accidents. Katie learned that Tony had survived and he had been badly injured in the confrontation with Mitchell, but had been evacuated from the restaurant and was receiving medical care under protective custody, and he would face charges for his role in the consortium operations, but prosecutors were offering a lenient sentence in exchange for his testimony and the data chip he provided. Lisa Chen's sacrifice was not forgotten, and Rodriguez ensured that her story was included in the broadcast follow-up reports, and the young woman who gave her life to save others became a symbol of resistance against corruption, and her name was honored alongside the other victims. And Prince Hassan al-Mansour was found alive, and his shuttle had not been destroyed but captured and held by the consortium, who planned to use him as leverage, and when the broadcast went out and the conspiracy collapsed, he was freed by security forces who turned against their corrupt commanders. And his first public statement was a call for comprehensive reform of corporate governance in the asteroid belt. 5 years after the fall of the consortium, humanity had transformed its presence in space in ways that would have seemed impossible before the exposure of the conspiracy, and the reforms implemented in the aftermath had created a more transparent and accountable system of governance that extended from Earth to the outer colonies. Katie Sullivan, now a practicing attorney specializing in corporate law and human rights, stood at a podium in the Grand Assembly Hall of the United Nations Extraterrestrial Affairs Division, and she was here to deliver the keynote address at the dedication ceremony for the Lisa Chen Memorial Station and a new habitat in the asteroid belt designed to provide resources and support for those fighting corruption throughout the solar system. The station had been funded by seized consortium assets and designed by the best architects humanity could offer, and it featured advanced security systems and secure communication networks and facilities for investigators and journalists and whistleblowers who needed protection while exposing wrongdoing. And it was a fortress for justice, and it bore the name of the woman who sacrificed herself so others could expose the truth. Katie began her speech by acknowledging those who could not be present and the 17 victims whose deaths had been covered up by the consortium, and the operatives who died fighting alongside Rodriguez and Tony, who passed away 2 years ago from complications related to his injuries, but lived long enough to see justice served, and Prince Hassan al-Mansour, who died 6 months ago in a shuttle accident that had been investigated thoroughly and confirmed to be genuinely accidental. She told the assembled dignitaries and media representatives about the warning note that started everything, and how a billionaire prince risked himself to save a stranger, and how that act of compassion sparked a chain of events that transformed human civilization in space, and how it proved that individual acts of courage could change the world. Danny Carter, now the director of the Solar System Security Coordination Agency, sat in the front row, and he had been instrumental in creating the agency, which coordinated security efforts across all human installations while maintaining strict oversight to prevent the kind of corruption that enabled the consortium, and his work had made space travel safer for everyone. Rodriguez, who had declined to attend officially, but was watching from a secure location, continued her work as an independent investigator, and she had been credited with exposing 3 major corruption schemes in the past 5 years, and her reputation as someone who could not be bought or intimidated had made her a legend in the intelligence community, and she preferred the shadows to the spotlight, but her impact was undeniable. Katie concluded her speech by talking about the future, and the consortium had been destroyed, but the forces that created it still existed, and greed and ambition and the desire for power. And these were fundamental human traits that could not be eliminated, but they could be checked and balanced and controlled through vigilance and accountability. The Lisa Chen Memorial Station represented humanity's commitment to that vigilance, and it would serve as a beacon for those fighting corruption, and a safe haven for whistleblowers, and a training center for the next generation of investigators and reformers. And it was a promise that humanity would never again allow power to go unchecked, and that the lessons learned from the consortium crimes would not be forgotten. After the ceremony, Katie met privately with Prince Hassan's sister and Princess Fatima al-Mansour, who had taken over the family business operations, and Fatima had continued her brother work in reforming the mining industry, and had become a powerful advocate for workers' rights throughout the asteroid belt. And she thanked Katie for honoring Hassan memory, and told her that her brother would have been proud of what she accomplished. They talked about the changes in the 5 years since the broadcast and the economic restructuring that created opportunities for smaller companies to compete fairly, and the political reforms that increased transparency and reduced corporate influence over government, and the cultural shift that made whistleblowing respectable rather than treasonous. But they also acknowledged the work that remained, and new threats emerged constantly as power seekers found fresh ways to exploit the system, and the outer colonies, where oversight was still developing, remained vulnerable to corruption, and Earth itself struggled with corporations that had adapted to the new regulations rather than truly reforming their practices. Katie accepted these challenges with the same determination that carried her through the original crisis, and she learned that fighting corruption was not about achieving a final victory but about maintaining constant pressure, and every case won was one step forward, and every law passed was one more barrier against abuse, and every person inspired to stand up for justice was another soldier in the ongoing war for humanity. So that evening, Katie toured the news station with Danny and Rodriguez, who had finally emerged from the shadows for this occasion, and they walked through the secure facilities and the investigation centers and the memorial hall where the names of corruption victims were inscribed in eternal remembrance, and it was impressive and solemn, and a fitting tribute to those who sacrificed for justice. In the memorial hall, they found a special exhibit dedicated to Prince Hassan and the warning note that started everything, and the actual napkin was displayed behind protective glass and its faded ink carefully preserved. And next to it was Katie's original testimony transcript and the data chip Tony gave her. And these artifacts told the story of how ordinary objects and ordinary people changed history. Rodriguez stood before the exhibit for a long time before speaking, and she said she had been in the information business for decades, dealing in secrets and conspiracies, and she had become cynical about humanity's capacity for good. But this case restored something in her, and it showed her that people would risk everything for strangers, and that courage existed even in the most unlikely places, and that truth could triumph over power when people were brave enough to speak it. Danny added that he had seen the worst of humanity during his security work and the casual cruelty and corruption that people inflicted on each other. But he also saw the best. And Tony, last minute redemption, and Lisa, sacrifice, and the security officers who turned against their corrupt commanders, and most of all Katie, courage in continuing the fight even when she could have taken Prince Hassan money and disappeared. Katie felt uncomfortable with the praise and protested that she just did what needed to be done and that anyone would have made the same choices. But Rodriguez shook her head, and most people would not have, and most people would have run or hidden or convinced themselves that it was not their problem. And that was how the consortium operated for so long, counting on people's fear and apathy. The fact that Katie had not run and that she chose to fight despite the odds was exactly what made her extraordinary in heroism. It was not about being fearless, and it was about being terrified and acting anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable. They left the memorial hall and went to the observation deck where the station's massive windows offered a view of the asteroid belt stretching into the distance, and mining operations dotted the field, and small lights marking human activity in the vast darkness. And each of those lights represented people working and living and building futures in this harsh environment. Katie thought about how different things might have been if Prince Hassan had not written his warning, and the consortium would still control these operations, exploiting workers and eliminating threats. And the 17 victims would be forgotten as accidents, and humanity expansion into space would have been built on a foundation of lies and murder. Instead, they created something better, and not perfect, and never perfect, but better, and a system where people could speak truth to power without being killed for it, and where corporations faced real consequences for their crimes, and where ordinary citizens had pathways to justice when they were wronged. Danny received a message on his pad and excused himself to handle some urgent business, and Rodriguez also departed soon after, citing her preference for privacy and her discomfort with public events. And Katie was left alone on the observation deck, watching the stars and the distant mining operations. A young woman approached her hesitantly and introduced herself as Sarah Kim, and a journalism student who wanted to interview Katie for her thesis on media coverage of the consortium scandal. And Katie agreed, and they sat down in a quiet corner of the observation deck. Sarah asked Katie, what advice she would give to young people who wanted to fight corruption, but felt powerless against the systems that protected the wealthy and connected. And Katie thought carefully before answering, and she said that power was not as absolute as it appeared, and every system, no matter how entrenched, depended on the cooperation of ordinary people. And when enough people refused to cooperate, the system broke down. The consortium had fallen because security officers refused to follow illegal orders, and because Tony finally chose his conscience over his fear, and because Lisa sacrificed herself for strangers, and because millions of ordinary citizens demanded justice when confronted with evidence of crimes. And none of these individuals had been powerful in the traditional sense, but together they were unstoppable. Katie also emphasized the importance of documentation and transparency, and the broadcast that destroyed